My name is David Weisburd. I'm from the George Mason University and the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. It's November 16th, 2018. We're here in Atlanta, Georgia at the American Society of Criminology meetings. And our purpose today is to interview Lorraine Mazerolle for the Oral History Criminology Project. Let me begin by telling you a little bit about Lorraine. Lorraine is an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow and the Chair of Criminology in the School of Social Science at the University of Queensland. She is a Chief Investigator with the ARC Center of Excellence for Children and Families over the Life Course, the Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Experimental Criminology, and a Fellow of the American Society of Criminology, the Academy of Experimental Criminology, and the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. Lorraine is the past chair of the ASC's Division of Experimental Criminology and the recipient of the ASC's 2018 Selen Glick Award. She also received the 2016 ASC Division of Policing Distinguished Scholar Award and the 2013 Academy of Experimental Criminology Joan McCord Award, and the 2010 ASC Division of International Criminology Freda Adler Distinguished Scholar Award. Her research interests are in experimental criminology, policing, drug law enforcement, regulatory crime control, and crime prevention. She has won numerous U.S. and Australian national competitive research grants on topics such as third-party policing, police engagement with high-risk people and disadvantaged communities, community regulation, problem-oriented policing, police technologies, civil remedies, street-level drug enforcement, and policing public housing sites. It's a great honor really for me to do this interview with Lorraine. Lorraine was my first PhD student and has had many amazing accomplishments in the field, and which is why she's being interviewed today. So where we want to begin is in the place of how Lorraine became a criminologist. So let me start by asking you, Lorraine, can you give us a little sense about your life before turning to academic pursuits?
Sure. Thank you very much for that introduction, David. It's really fantastic that we're here today having this conversation, so thank you. So I actually wanted to be a criminologist when I was 14. Did you know that, David?
No, I didn't.
You didn't. So when I was 14, I was fascinated with newspaper stories about people being murdered. And I could never really understand why is it that a person could harm another person. So I was really interested in criminology really from a very early age. And my school guidance counsellor said to me if I wanted to be a criminologist, I'd have to join the police department. So in those days, this is a long time ago, in the 1980s, they said that the day after your 17th birthday, you could walk into the police department and sign up to be a criminologist, police officer. And so the day after my 17th birthday, I grabbed my girlfriend. I said, come on, we're going to go and join the police department. So I walked in there and they put me under the height restriction, and I was 5'3" 3/4. And for the record, I'm now 5'4". So I've now met the criteria. But in those days, I was 1/4 of an inch too short. So they threw me out on the out of the door, and I thought my career as a criminologist was done and dusted right there. So I went off to university to do an economics degree, actually, and in my first year, they had a careers day, and a session on criminology was being held there. So I'm doing an economics degree, but I still had this real interest in criminology. So I went along to the careers session and met a criminologist. His name was Adam Sutton, who became a very famous Australian criminologist, actually. And at the time he was working with the Office of Crime Statistics. So I went over and introduced myself and said to him that I wanted to be a criminologist. And he said to me, do every methods and statistics course that I can do, because there was really no criminology in those days. This is the early 1980s in Australia. And so I went and did volunteer work for him in the summers and coded data and made myself probably a nuisance in his office. And anyway, when I finished my degree, he gave me my first job on a short-term contract, and that's where it all started.
So that was sort of how you got interested in criminology, and then wondered whether you weren't interested, and then got interested again. So how did it become, I mean, your career is based on a long research and professional history of interest in specific areas. So now you're in Australia, you're working with Sutton, and now you're thinking about what to do next. So how did you get to the next stage?
Yeah, so the next stage was really, it's all about serendipity, I think, how these careers take shape. So I was then working for the National Police Research Unit, which was a research agency in Adelaide in South Australia. And we had a summer program where scholars from all over the world would come and work there for a couple of months every year. And this one particular summer, David Bailey and Ron Clarke both were there. And so I worked with both of them, and both of them asked me if I'd be interested in coming to the States to do my PhD. By this stage I had an undergraduate degree and a honours degree. And so I was 25 and thought this was a really great idea. And so I put my backpack on my back and landed in Newark, New Jersey. Actually, let's go back a little bit. So I had to choose between going to SUNY Albany, where David Bailey was at the time, or Rutgers, where Ron Clarke was the dean. And Ron Clarke said to me, if you come to Rutgers, I'll give you an office where you can see the Statue of Liberty. And as a 25-year-old, that's kind of cool, right? So you can either go upstate New York or you can see the Statue of Liberty from your office, which you would remember on the 13th floor of the SI Newhouse Centre of Crime and Justice. You could basically see the flame. Did you know that? Out of my office window you could see the flame of the Statue of Liberty. So it was kind of not really seeing the Statue of Liberty. Right? Do you remember that?
No, I don't remember seeing it.
At the time, David was the director of the Centre for Crime Prevention Studies.
I think we go, the Centre for Crime Prevention Studies.
Well, if you'd gazed out of the window at all times of the day and night working, you might have seen
I was obviously focused on my work.
Obviously, but I obviously wasn't, right? No.
So tell us a bit more about how you, because I know that when you came to Rutgers, it was like a trial by fire, right?
Right.
You didn't know, in a sense, you were supposed to come, if I remember correctly, in August for the academic year. And then I'd called you on the phone and said, come earlier.
So David did call me on the phone and say, come earlier. And you had just won a massive grant from NIJ for the Drug Markets Analysis Program. And so you needed a program director to help bring the program together with you. And so you said to me on the phone, you can either come to America now, like now, and jump on a plane and come and take on this more senior role, or if you come in 6 months' time, you can work as a research assistant. Do you remember that?
Yes.
So I jumped on a plane and landed, and I reckon within 12 hours of landing in America, in Newark, New Jersey, I was sitting in your office at 9 o'clock in the next morning, and then it was absolutely full on for the next 3 years.
So I remember that well, and I the willingness to go out there and stake out territory in a foreign land with people you didn't really know. And I'll tell you on the other side, I probably haven't said this before, that I was also had this very large project and I needed someone really good to run it. And Ron Clarke came into my office and said, I have the person for you. She's from Australia. I've just spent time with her. She's great. Get on the phone and get her to come. So we were very interested in your visiting. At Rutgers, once you were there and you started working on this project, and it's important to note that you were the field director for this project, so this was a lot of work in the field, for example, also analytic work. What other experiences at Rutgers sort of pushed you in a certain direction? And maybe talk a little bit, as you do that, about how coming to work with me in the center also sort of staked out would later become central ideas of your work.
Sure. Look, I think that it was an amazing time at Rutgers. You were at Rutgers, Jeff Fagan was at Rutgers, Andrew von Hirsch was at Rutgers, Todd Clear, Ron Clarke, Freda Adler. It was an amazing group. Oh, Don Gottfredson was there. It was an amazing group of scholars, and you were an assistant professor. In fact, you weren't tenured at that stage. You'd just come from the Vera Institute, come off a big project, and was establishing yourself as an assistant professor. So it was a pretty amazing time, really, to land. It was also right at the height of the crack cocaine epidemic. So the violence in the middle of urban areas in America at the time was just extraordinary. And so the timing of the drug policy modelling program, coupled with this hotbed of intellectual thought at Rutgers at the time, I think made it an extraordinary combination of a huge amount of opportunity. So, and the drug market analysis program, if you remember, had 5 different cities. So it had Kansas City that Larry Sherman was running. It had Hartford that group was running. Richard Larson, I think, was running the Hartford site. John Eck was running the San Diego site. Jackie Cullen and Will Gore were running the Pittsburgh site. So it was this multi-site program of work, and we were really thrust into this environment with a high-level advisory group. Craig Yachida, Al Reese, Mike Maltz was on the advisory group of that drug policy modelling program. So you had just come off the Minneapolis hotspots experiment, and I don't know if you remember, but I did all the displacement analysis of the Minneapolis hotspots experiment, and then we were full on into the field work around drug policy modelling program. So the intellectual environment was at the very early stage of problem-oriented policing. Remember, this is 1990, early 1990. It was when situational crime prevention was starting to get a foothold in the US. You were just starting to think about place. This was really some of the early stages of you thinking about place. And if you remember at that stage, the police were sort of a little bit, the poor cousin, if you like, in criminology. They were not seen as being particularly effective. It was, this was at the time of the community corrections movement, that there was a lot of money going into community corrections. So I think this whole sort of combination really created a perfect environment to stake out sort of new ideas, new intellectual ideas.
So it's, in a way, you were all of a sudden thrust into a world in which not only the people at Rutgers could have influence, but Larry Sherman, Mike Maltz, Al Reese, and others. So it was obviously a very influential set of ideas. We can talk to us for a moment about, what were the kinds of influences? Maybe start, and you might want to end there as well, with Ron Clarke, who I know had a big influence on the way you were thinking. Sure.
So, look, I think coming from Australia and coming into the American environment at a very difficult time in American American history in terms of what was happening with the crack cocaine epidemic. I think from my point of view at that time, it was really trying to find ways to destabilise these problems and to make even just a little bit of difference, just to reduce the violence. And I think right from the outset I felt very passionate about the children that were in these drug markets. I mean, and you would remember this, when we'd go into these crack houses and, you know, these children that were living in these horrendous environments, and the drug markets and program that we were running in Jersey City wasn't the only place that we were going. Very early on, I had that opportunity to do research in Oakland, California. David and I and other members of the team, we'd go to different places all around Australia to look at how other narcotic squads were dealing with these problems. So we were going in and out of these crack houses all over America and seeing horrendous disruption into these people's lives. And it was particularly the children that really got me, because if you go all the way back to when I was 14, it was like, how can these people be hurting these other people? How can we make these people's lives better? And I don't know whether you remember, but there was at one stage I thought I didn't want to be an academic. I don't know whether you remember, where I thought, you know, maybe I can make a difference more by becoming a social worker and getting out of academia and working more at the street level. And what I was seeing in the street workers was that they didn't have longevity in terms of their roles. You know, they burnt out really quickly, and I could see that the burnout for these people was horrendous. And so I thought, you know, if you're one step removed, you probably have a longer time span, longer shelf life in terms of working in this area.
Well, I think we're lucky in criminology you decided to stay. But I guess maybe before we go to talking more in depth about your work, maybe you say a little bit more about the Oakland Beat Health Project. You mentioned that we at the center had been in contact with that group, and then I went out to California and you went out to California, and then you decided to take that on as your dissertation project. But it wasn't just a project in some sense, because the ideas that you developed on the dissertation had a big influence the rest of your career.
Yeah.
So maybe talk a little bit about Beat Health and what you're doing and how that influenced the direction of your work.
So we had an opportunity through the centre to do an evaluation of the Beat Health program. And because of there was so much research that the Centre of Crime Prevention Studies at the time was doing, I took over that project and decided to do that project as my PhD thesis. So I was going out to California for a month at a time to immerse myself in the crack cocaine problem. And I think what's so interesting about that program is that it was a program led by the police. It was an idea of Bob Crawford, who was a sergeant in the Oakland Police Department at the time, and he was building partnerships with other city agencies, with different inspectors in the fire department, in rodent control, in health and safety, to bring these other regulators into dealing essentially with the crack cocaine crime problems at the time in Oakland. So what fascinated me about what Bob Crawford was bringing together was, one, that this was a police officer that was very problem focused. He had a problem and he was very charismatic, and he was co-opting these other city inspectors that didn't have to go there. You know, they didn't have to go with Bob to these crack houses to do these inspections. He was co-opting them, and he was bringing them along to say, help me with these problems. And so that really was the was the fertile ground for this idea of third-party policing. These were third parties brought into a crime problem, and they were engaged in crime control in a way that they never really intended. They were there to support Bob, but they were also there fulfilling their other roles around fire safety and health safety. So it really seeded those ideas, and really you and Ron were both on my dissertation committees and my dissertation committee, and so you gave me the freedom to explore this, and I'm really appreciative of that opportunity to go explore these new ideas, and it was kind of an idea that I think was, at the time, it wasn't really part of the problem-solving checklist of things that problem-solving could do. It has, obviously got synergies with problem-oriented policing at the time, but they used one approach for every single crack house. It was the same approach. So they weren't doing the deep analysis of the problem. They were using the one approach, and it was quite routinized, and everyone was doing it, or everyone meaning all the inspectors would come along to these beat health inspections as a matter of routine. And I think that that's what's so different about third-party policing to problem-oriented policing, is that everyone got into this routine of going, and they weren't doing any deep analysis of the specifics of the problem, but they were going to 300 crack houses, in a year, 300 that they were targeting. That's 300 inspections. That's a lot of inspections that they were going to.
Well, I think that helps a lot in understanding how your early work connects to the major contributions you've made. So you've already started in this direction a bit, but one of the things that this project is interested in learning about is that, in your case, is there a major theme around which all of your work coheres? Or are there several smaller agendas?
Oh, look, I think that, I'm a policing scholar, so I've been interested in police effectiveness. But David, one of the things that you always taught me was that you've got to think, it's not just an evaluation. By just evaluation, you're not just looking at this program and seeing whether it works. And I think that that's a real differentiating feature of the work that you've done and that you've taught me to do, is what does this mean for theory? What does this mean for the theory of policing? So when you've talked about the theory of place, that's come from your evaluation research. And so the theory of third-party policing and understanding these partnerships and understanding the utilisation of legal levers in the context of partnering has really been a feature of when I run experiments, when I'm doing research, is understanding those frontiers of theorising. Where can we push the theories to understand it? It's been the same thing in terms of looking at procedural justice policing. That's what got us to some of the research that we've been doing around the Queensland Community Engagement Trial, for example. The development of the dialogue that really operationalised the theory of procedural justice into a dialogue, into a usable dialogue, and to see how that actually plays out in the field has been a really exciting another strand to my research in more recent years. But it's always trying to sort of think about the theory. We're right now at the University of Queensland, we're really interested in this concept of harmonising legal socialisation. So in a trial that we've been doing called the ACEP trial, the Ability School Engagement Program, that's a partnership between the police and the schools, and the legal lever in the context of that partnership is around the truancy laws. And so it's bringing together the police and the schools and trying to harmonise how how a young person, a truant and their parent, the schools and the police can come together to communicate to a young person what their legal obligations are and what the laws are. So it's part of this harmonising of legal socialisation that we're theorising around. But that theorising comes all the way back to what we did with the Drug Markets Project, what we did with the Oakland Beat Health Project, and what we've been doing with the Queensland Community Engagement Program, and now with the ASEP program.
So I think it's important for someone listening to this tape to know that, for example, in the recent National Academy of Sciences report on proactive policing, one of the relatively small group of strategies that was noted was third-party policing. In other words, this idea of third-party policing has had a very strong impact on the way people think about the types of approaches that police could use. So this is really a discovery, in some sense, of a new way of thinking about what police powers could do, etc. Could you, and that I think is very, it's a new approach, a new tactic, the idea of bringing other people in. Could you go through quickly the other you mentioned two other themes from two other projects. How do those alter the way in which people generally do things? And maybe also, while you're at it, start with Beat Health. How does it alter the traditional way police went and dealt with things?
Sure. So at the core of third-party policing is this concept of partnerships. Now, it's not that police hadn't done partnerships before. They had done partnerships before. What third-party policing is creating the partnerships around utilising another agent's legal levers. So this is the other agent. So in the context of Beat Health, the city inspectors have their own laws, and prior to Beat Health, those laws weren't used for a crime control purpose. And when Bob Crawford started to partner with them, he was wanting them to use their laws. Now, how controversial is that? Is using laws that weren't intended for a crime control purpose to be used for a crime control purpose. So there is some controversy there. However, what it does though is it comes back to our conversation yesterday, and I'm going to deviate here for a minute if that's okay.
It's your interview.
Yeah, so Sally Simpson, she was giving the Sutherland speech 2 nights ago here at ASC 2018. And David and I went out for dinner after Sally's speech, and we were talking about the way that civil laws and administrative laws are used to deal with white-collar offenders. And we had a really interesting, David and I had a really interesting conversation about that, because in some ways, dealing with street offenders criminally makes it really difficult for young offenders, low-level offenders, getting caught up in the criminal justice system. If they're dealt with administratively or through civil laws or regulatory laws, the consequences for them are actually much, much less. So if they're cited and given a fine for violation of health and safety, that's a very different pathway. That's a different snare for them, if you like, than getting involved in or getting charged and arrested around a criminal violation. So this sort of idea that the civil administrative laws are a backdoor around crime control, if you think about it, it potentially is a way forward for how we deal with a lot of the lower level kinds of offending. And I'm not saying for 1 minute that drug dealing is a low level offending. It has a lot of harm. However, if you think about the tragedy of young offenders getting caught up in the criminal justice system around drug offences, for example, and what the implications that is for their future employment and for their future well-being and their likelihood of long-term dependence on the welfare system. You know, using other avenues to have a carrot and stick, a punishment for offending not in the criminal law is potentially a better way about it. And that's really what's at the heart of third-party policing.
And is that also connected to the other themes that you were talking about in terms of your work? Or do those other themes capture another perspective?
Well, yes. So in the Ability School Engagement Program, it's a third-party policing intervention. It's the partnership between the police and the schools, and it's using the schools' legal laws around truancy. However, we have infused into the partnership between the police and the schools, and of the way that they're communicating with the parents and the children, this dialogue of procedural justice policing. So if you are trying to get people to comply with the laws, so these are not criminal laws, these are civil laws, truancy laws are civil laws. If you're trying to get parents to comply with these laws and the young people to willingly go to school, then why not use the dialogue of procedural justice so that they willingly engage in attending school more than having to go to the prosecution end of utilising those laws. So it's gaining willing compliance at the bottom of the regulatory pyramid. So we are starting to infuse these ideas around legitimacy policing, procedural justice policing into third-party policing, so it doesn't have that spectre of oppression of people.
So when you think about this contribution of third-party policing and its relationship to these other types of approaches that are not only about the police, this has been an idea that is not just something you have thought about way back when. It's had tremendous traction, both in the world of policing and I think in academic discussions of the police and what they ought to be doing. Along the way, have you found that there were major debates, criticisms brought around your work that you've had to think through and react to? And to what do you attribute the staying power? Because it's natural in academia for ideas to develop, for people to try to beat them down. So ideas that sustain, you know, there's obviously something about that leads to that.
Yeah, look, I think that there's a couple of issues there. One is that the word third-party policing is a little bit obscure. So if we'd gone with partnership policing, I think it would have had a much more universal appeal. And because it is about partnership policing, but it's a particular type of partnership policing. But it's not, and I should say that the ideas that are around this have not just been my ideas. I've worked a lot with Michael Berger, I've worked a lot with Janet Ransley around developing these ideas, and that's been really formative in terms of developing these ideas. And going to Australia at a time where the Ayres and Braithwaite regulatory pyramid was very popular, was very influential in understanding this escalation of this legal lever through the regulatory pyramid, which hasn't really had as much traction in the US context. But the question you asked then is, what about the controversies? And there are controversies around it, and particularly around the manner in which third-party policing could have backfire effects. And Matthew Desmond and Valdez wrote a very critical, very well researched article that looked at the exclusion of people in unstable housing, and how the civil laws could be used to evict people from housing. Where do those people then go? And so, you know, that's a negative way that third-party policing could be used, because it then perpetuates a problem, doesn't solve the problem. It might solve the problem in that particular apartment block, but these people, where are they displacing to? So I think that these are really important criticisms. Tracy Mears has proposed some criticisms as well as to how, you know, where is the fairness around the distribution of third-party policing. So I think we're very alert to those criticisms, and Janet and I wrote a chapter in our book published by Cambridge University Press on third-party policing that really engaged with these criticisms of third-party policing, because I think in any type of intervention, there's always the potential for it to be misused, for it to have the backfire effect. And I think that that's obviously not, you know, what we want to see from third-party policing. So I come back to the regulatory pyramid. It's the willing compliance, and how do you get that willing compliance? So if you've got someone living in a public housing site, and people are coming and going in and out of that apartment, dealing drugs, causing a lot of problems for the other people in the apartment, and you just evict them. You use these regulatory laws to evict them, and you displace them. That's not consistent with the regulatory pyramid. In the regulatory pyramid, you would start by trying to gain willing compliance, which requires the dialogue of procedural justice policing. So you'd go into the apartment that's got the problem, and you'd sit down in a facilitated way to communicate, look, here's the rules. This is the rules. You're breaking the rules. We don't want you to break the rules. What can we do to help? What sort of social support, what sort of support can we give you to help you comply with the laws? And that's a very different approach. And if that's led by the police in partnership with public housing, you start to get willing compliance. And that is where I think the power of this partnership approach of third-party policing really lies. So, yes, does it mean that if they don't comply, there is a consequence? Yes, there is a consequence. But we don't want it to escalate to the point of eviction. We want it to stay at that bottom rung of the regulatory pyramid where there's willing compliance.
Well, thank you very much. I think that clarifies a lot in terms of what you're trying to do, and also the ends being also consistent with what your goals are in this process of helping people, right back to the age of 14. What do you think your identifying characteristics as a scholar are?
Well, in the early days, I was very driven. It's not that I'm not driven anymore, but I think that the finding your place in the world of academia is very hard. Differentiating yourself from your supervisors, for example. So David Weisburd and Ron Clarke, two Stockholm Prize winners, being my co-chairs of my committee. That's a pretty awesome supervisory mentoring group. And I think right from the outset, I wanted to strike out on my own, if you like. And so David and I, we worked together for 4 or 5 years. And then if you look at my CV, we really did not publish again together until this year. so 2018. So there's a 20-year gap between when we last published together and when we've published together again, and we've maintained a fantastic friendship over nearly 30 years. But it was really trying in the early years. It was really trying to establish myself as an independent scholar. Now, I actually think I over dramatise that, and I've often, talked to my students about this issue, because I think that you can still work together with your supervisors without having to be so dramatic about trying to hoe your own pathway. So I think that if in those early years it was really trying to establish myself as a separate entity to the work that we'd done in the early years, and where you were going with your work around the law of concentration of place and what have you. And so that would be the early years. And then I think that the biggest disruption into my academic life was having children. So I have 2 children. They're 21 and 18 now. And so Matt was born in 1997. So that's a massive disruption into your academic life when you have children. And for any scholars out there, men and women who are having children in academia, if you've got a block in your academic track record where you're not publishing that much because you're running around changing diapers and trying to get your children to kindergarten, then that's okay, because it's not a death to your academic career. So there's big gaps in my publishing career because of having children. And in 2000, Paul Mazerolle and I moved back to Australia. At the time, we had a 6-month-old and a three-year-old. That international move is a massive change, because the Australian academic environment was so different. I'd spent 10 years in all my formative early academic career being in the US. So I went from Rutgers to do my PhD, and I was 2 years as a assistant professor at Northeastern University, and then 5 years as a assistant professor and associate professor at University of Cincinnati, and then went back to Australia in 2000. So having children, international move, completely disrupted my life. And when I first went to Australia, the police really didn't do any research with at all, and certainly not with academics. So establishing a field work with a very hostile police agency in those days, which is completely different now. We've got great relationships, and we have done for many, many years with the Queensland Police Service and police agencies in Australia. So that really shaped the early years of my time in Australia, because I couldn't do intervention experimentation in the early years. So that's when I built the Australian Community Capacity Study. It's called ACCS. You can look at it online. The Australian Community Capacity Study was about replicating a longitudinal survey of place, of communities, to understand the way community regulation and collective efficacy in the Australian context. And it was right at the time that collective efficacy was starting to have some traction here in the US. And so doing a survey was really my only option, because I couldn't work with police. So that's now a longitudinal study of place. We've done 5 waves of thousands and thousands of surveys across 148 communities in Brisbane. And I've had a very talented former PhD student, now Associate Professor Rebecca Wicks, that I've been working on, and she's now the lead and has been for a number of years on that program of work. So my interest in place never waned. It was, that's still been about understanding police effectiveness in the context of community regulation and community functioning as well. So, so there's been some very distinct eras in my career, some of which have been driven by having a family, by international relocation, and you get a bit older and a little bit more balanced in your work life. Has that happened to you yet, David?
You've already talked a little bit about things that have happened that have made it hard for you, or that have caused changes in the way you dealt with your career, having children, moving countries, and obviously those are things you wanted to do very much, irrespective of what its immediate impact would be on your academic development. Now, obviously it hasn't hurt you too much, because I think you're probably one of the youngest winners of the recent awards that you've won at the ASC, an international award, as well as becoming a fellow. I guess there are two questions related to that. One is, are there things you would have done differently? You say to myself, I shouldn't have done that, I should have gone off. You talked a little bit about working, becoming so intense on independence. It's an understandable thing because it's raised often, right? And related to that is there'll be young scholars looking at this. You've already raised issue. I think it is an issue. Having children from men is also raised issue, but for women it can raise special issues. In the end, they have the babies per se, for example. So if you have suggestions for younger scholars watching us now, some advice for them about the future. So I think those related. One is, are there things that I would have done differently? And the second is, what kind of advice would you give to younger scholars, maybe to young women who are embarking on an academic career as well as men?
Yeah. So maybe I'll take the second question first. I think the main thing is to never lose sight of work-life balance, and I'm guilty of losing sight of that work-life balance, and so I just don't think it's worth it. And these days, people are going to be working till they're 70. People are living, or even older. People are living till they're much older. I mean, we've got Freda Adler's here at ASC 2018, and someone told me last night she's turning 90.
That's right, yes.
So we've got Al Bloomstein here, we've got Sam Walker here, we've got David Bailey here. These are people in their 80s, coming here to ASC. Now, I can guarantee that I'll be on the golf course, and I will not be coming to ASC when in my 80s, but that's just my choice.
I think we should have that documented and see what happens.
I will be on the golf course trying to still figure out how to hit that white ball, but that's a different story. The point is that I think that it's not a race, and I think that if I was looking again, I don't think I would have just been quite so driven about trying to do so much and trying to pack so much in. I would have taken it a little bit slower. And certainly along the way things do happen where you've got to slow down when you've got children that you need to look after their well-being and make sure that you're there. So I don't travel that much. It's a little bit different now because my kids are a little bit older, but in the early days when they're 6, 7, for me to go away for 2 days was a huge deal because I'd be missing sports day, or getting them off to school and picking them up, and for them 2-3 days is a long time. The problem with being in Australia is you have the tyranny of distance. It's a huge deal to get on a plane and come to the United States, so that's been really challenging. So there's been times that I've gotten on a plane and spent 36 hours on the ground in Washington DC and gone straight back again. So I've actually spent more time on the plane than I have on the ground to come to a meeting or a conference gathering in the United States, and that takes a tremendous toll on your health, your well-being. You know, there's been times that I've stood up and given a keynote address in the Northern Hemisphere, and I can barely even string 2 words together. It's amazing that I've even been able to do that. And whenever you tell me that you're jet lagged, what do I say to you?
I don't know, not as bad as Australia.
No, we're not having that conversation about jet lag, so you don't get any sympathy from me whatsoever. So the point is that to young, you know, to anyone really, don't lose sight of that work-life balance. And you've actually been very good at this, David. You've maintained your work-life balance pretty well. And yeah, do you think you have?
I think I've tried, but I think that it's a problem for everyone.
Yeah.
Now my daughter is an academic, and having children, I see that it's an especially difficult problem for women who decide to have families. So I think you have to work at it. I think that it's an issue in criminology that people don't deal with. In other words, what you're saying is very important.
Everyone
because
wants to push under the carpet.
I think many people, in younger people, make decisions on the career side to focus in, and they sort of lose some of the other side, the family and personal side. And you know, you have to ask yourself something about what happens later on.
Yeah.
Right, I think that's
right.
the issue.
So I think that, and so the other question you asked me is there any sort of bits of work that I've done that I wouldn't have done? And I would say yes again to that as well. So what happens is that when you have lots of postdocs and PhD students that become financially dependent on you, that you're raising funds and hiring them, and they're on short-term contracts, and they might have young children themselves, that puts a lot of pressure on you to maintain the funding stream. And so I've done contracts or tenders, you know, I've tendered for this or done contracts, or I've taken on research projects that sometimes if I really ran a ruler over and said, is this something intellectually that I really want to do? No, they're not. I've done it for other reasons, and I'm not sure that that's always been in my best interest, or for that matter, even in the student's best interest, or the postdoc's best interest, because that dependency, I'm not sure, has always been good. So, and some of those contracts, you know, they're short term, they're highly dependent on the agency that you're working to give a report for, and so you sort of drop everything, and then how many papers are sitting there, and you know, the top drawer problem. And so I think that less is more. You know, do 1 or 2 projects at a time and make sure that you get the paper out. Now that's easier said than done, and you're smiling because we all have so much data that is unexplored, and we haven't really exploited it, and it's, you know, expensive to collect. So, you know, I do think less is more.
Well, that's a good lead-in to the next question I wanted to ask you, which was about your mentoring philosophy. Right, you talked about the students and your obligation to them. So how would you describe more generally your mentoring philosophy? Because you have mentored a large number of students. You sometimes call them my grand students, if you said to me once. But so what's, because it takes a certain amount of generosity to be able to mentor students well. And it's another time consideration. So what's your philosophy? How do you think about mentoring that might help other people who are moving in this direction to become, you know, to do it better, or to understand what they're getting themselves into, perhaps?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think you should ask my students. My students would probably go, oh, God, how is she going to answer this question? Oh, she's a pain in the neck. And I probably am a pain in the neck, so sorry. Look, I really care about my students, obviously. You know, you know, they're starting out, they've got great ideas, they're learning the skills, they're learning the trade. You know, I try really, really, really hard to give them opportunities to come to ASC, for example. You know, the amount of money that I have spent over the years to bring my students all the way, you know, from Australia here, to open their world outside Australia, to open them to the rest of the world. And I know this is, you know, America's not the rest of the world, but I have also sent them to the European criminology conferences, to the British Society of Criminology conferences. And that takes a lot of money. I mean, I think one year, I spent $50,000 on bringing students out to come to ASC. That's a lot of money. So, and that's only one part of mentoring, obviously. You know, you've got the day-to-day mentoring, creating opportunities for them to have good data, having training opportunities for them to learn really good quantitative skills and qualitative method skills, and taking a mixed method sort of approach to their thesis. And it's a very different PhD structure in Australia. So you don't have 2 years of coursework, then comprehensive exams, and then a thesis. When you come into a PhD in the Australian context, it's the British model where you come, day one, you're studying on your thesis. And that poses a huge amount of responsibility to give them students the opportunity to learn methodological skills. And so I hope that through the resources that I've been able to raise over the years to give them those kinds of opportunities. But at the end of the day, it's about them finding themselves as who they are as academics. And some people really, you know, find that pathway very quickly and easily. Other people take longer to find their niche. But I think you have to ask my students that.
So let me just ask you, Frank Cullen received the mentoring award this year, and when he went up to the podium and he said, well, you know, academic work is very important. I've always been very invested, I believe is what he said. And then he said, but, you know, your papers won't love you. Is the term he used, right? I think it was something like that.
And I was on the faculty with Frank Cullen, so I know his mentoring methods.
But I was just going to say that and I knew Frank felt this way about the Mentor Award because he wrote me when I received the Mentor Award about how, and put in an article how jealous he is that something he really thinks is really important, which is great. But it also talks about that other side, what you get back from mentoring.
Yeah.
So do you see that as well? That, I mean, Frank obviously was trying to give the message that when you mentor people, you get something back, not just the paper in a journal. You get a kind of long-term relationship and other reinforcement back, that there's something different. So I wonder if you want to say something about that.
Look, I think that when you see your students out there with their own students and out there, you know, when they publish an article in a top journal and you know that that's one of your students, it's you know, well, I hate to say this, you're kind of like a proud parent, aren't you? Because you're seeing these students, you know, accomplish really great things.
Well, there's a Yiddish word for that. It's called nachas.
Nachas.
You get nachas from your children.
And you do. And they're not your children, you know, so you've always got to remember they are not your children, they're students, and so it is a little bit different. But the pride that you have to see them succeed, to see them accomplish, you know, really good, if they get awards, you know, when they are receiving their own awards on their own terms with their own work, you know, I think that's a huge that does give you a lot of joy. It's a source of pride, and you know that they're off on their way. And I think that the other thing that I found with my students is that over time, they're like, and I hate to make this analogy with children because you shouldn't, but they go away and they might be a bit pissed off with you for a while, but then they come back. Is that how you felt? They do. They go away and then they come back. And it's that coming back when, you know, it might be 5 years later and they send you a message saying, by the way, I just did this keynote address. Thank you for everything that you taught me. You know, that coming back, and you probably have felt this many, many times over the years, but that's the true, I think that's the true sign of a mentored scholar that has become their own person, their own scholar.
Well, we're coming to the end of the interview, but one thing that the ASC likes to ask people is about the sort of general thoughts on where the field is going and whether there are directions the field ought to go into. I think it's important here because especially your early work with me and later work then, was a challenge to the traditional paradigms in some sense, both in policing and more generally in the kinds of subjects that were central, at least in many areas of criminology. So do you feel, do you have some thoughts on where the field is going, ways in which you would encourage the field to move a bit differently?
Sure. So I think that the ASC introducing all these divisions and a very rapid increase in divisions over the last 5-6 years has created some real good opportunities. I think there's some issues about the synergies between the divisions, but the division of policing, for example, is the largest division in the American Society of Criminology now. Now that creates some unique opportunities to engage with the leaders in policing, and there's opportunities to bring police practitioner leaders into the debates on policing in an academic forum. So I think that where ASC is going, which is kind of ironic, and why it's ironic I'll say in a minute, the direction in which the ASC is going, where the field's going, is building these research partnerships with practitioners. So more and more we're seeing people outside of the traditional academic roles coming to ASC and really engaging in the academic debates, giving their own papers. We've got practitioners now coming in their own right and giving academic papers. So I think that that's a really positive direction. What's ironic about it is that it's my understanding, I might have this wrong, but ACJS actually was a breakaway from ASC 40 years ago, I think it was, because the people who started ACJS at the time actually saw ASC as not having that dialogue with practitioners. So it's kind of ironic now to see these divisions emerging that have created a forum for practitioners and academics to have to come together in a academic conference setting to have these debates over research, and I think that's a really positive thing.
And that's a departure also for traditional social science, at least, or and many other areas as well, that the importance you're placing on practitioners as being part of the science,
that's right.
is different.
And we could say some things about that in terms of evidence-based policy, not just in policing, but in all realms, where the practitioners are really taking ownership over their own science. And I think that these creations of these divisions is really is part of that movement towards the practitioners owning their own science.
So the last part of our interview is whether there are issues you'd like to bring up and put on record that haven't been raised in this interview. I don't think you have to, but if you have something you think is important in terms of young criminologists that might look at this interview to think about their career, about where academia is going, etc. So if you have something else you'd like to add, this is the opportunity to do it.
Okay. I didn't know that was a question on there, so surprise. Look, I think that there's a couple of things. One is I do think that the Academy is really embracing diversity in terms of women, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of race, in terms of in all areas. And I think that's a really positive thing. If you have a look at the leadership in terms of the presidents of the ASC, many women over the last 10 years have been the presidents, and we've got a president now, female president, and certainly into the future. So I think that that's a fantastic change from when I started, and certainly working in the policing field, which had been so male dominated. I think that the opportunities for women are great. I also think that the internationalisation, I mean, we live in a global world now, and the more that the ASC can embrace research papers from all over the world. In the old days, ASC used to have, if you were an Australian scholar using Australian data, you'd be put on the Australian panel or put on some obscure panel that was on a Saturday morning with a person from Korea and Argentina and Australia, anywhere else but America. And you don't see that so much anymore. I think that there's a much more international integration. I think that that's where, we live in a global world. We don't, the barriers are not there. It's, it's much easier now to traverse those borders. And I think that the field, as it matures and as it grows, being more international in terms of paying attention to the European scholarship, paying attention to the Asian scholarship, to the South American scholarship, I think is really important.
Well, thank you very much, Lorraine, for a very interesting interview. I learned a lot.
And can I just say, thank you, David, for all your mentorship, for your friendship, and I think this has been a fantastic opportunity to have you interview me.